Introduction. The high-stakes poker game at the Gilded Lily was meant to cement a blood oath between two of the city's most lethal dynasties. It was supposed to be the treaty that finally brought peace to the underground. Instead, it was exactly 8 minutes away from becoming a slaughterhouse. Lorenzo Moretti, the most calculated don in the city, sat swirling a glass of neat bourbon, completely unaware that the woman wearing his family's diamond had just signaled his execution. But she didn't count on one thing: the ghost in the server's vest refilling the crystal decanters. One whispered sentence. 11 sharp words. That warning didn't just save a man's life, it ignited a war that would turn the underworld to ash. This is the story of how a waitress became the only player who mattered. The Gilded Lily was the kind of lounge where the velvet was red enough to hide bloodstains, and the smoke was thick enough to bury secrets. Tucked beneath the city's foundations, it was a fortress of gold leaf and shadow where men gambled with territories and human lives. Ilara Vance adjusted the stiff collar of her uniform, fighting the urge to lean against the cold marble pillar. It was 11:52 p.m. Her shift had begun 12 hours ago, and her feet were throbbing in the cheap, scuffed flats she wore to stay silent. But pain was a luxury she couldn't afford. She needed the blood money tips from this vault to keep the debt collectors away from her door. Table 1 needs a bottle of the 50-year-old Pappy. Don't speak, don't breathe, and for God's sake don't look them in the eye. The floor manager, a man who smelled of anxiety and cheap cologne, hissed as he shoved a silver tray into her hands. Ilara took a steadying breath and stepped into the VIP vault. Table 1 was the center of the universe tonight. Lorenzo Moretti sat at the head, radiating a lethal stillness that made the air feel thin. He was 32, with ink-black hair and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from obsidian. He didn't look at his cards. He looked at his opponents with eyes that were terrifyingly void of emotion. To his right sat Sofia Romano, the fiancée. Sofia was a vision in midnight lace, her dark hair pinned back with pins that looked like tiny daggers. She was laughing at a joke made by a Romano lieutenant, a sound that was light, melodic, and entirely predatory. Ilara had spent 3 years surviving this room by watching what people didn't say. She knew a kill signal when she saw one. Sofia's hands were perfectly still, but her eyes were tracking the second hand of the grandfather clock in the corner. Tick, tick, tick. Ilara approached the table like a shadow. This was her superpower: invisibility. To the titans of the underworld, Ilara wasn't a woman. She was a piece of the furniture that delivered alcohol. More bourbon, sir? Ilara asked, her voice a hollow whisper. Lorenzo didn't acknowledge her. He simply tapped the rim of his glass. As Ilara tilted the heavy bottle, she saw it. Sofia's hand moved to her neck, adjusting her diamond necklace. As she did, she flipped the Queen of Hearts from her hidden sleeve and tucked it under the base of her wineglass, the signal for the snipers in the rafters to fire. Ilara's heart thundered against her ribs. She checked the clock. 11:59 p.m. 60 seconds. She leaned down, ostensibly to wipe a drop of condensation from the table. Her lips brushed the air near Lorenzo's ear, so close she could smell the smoke and oak on his breath. The Queen of Hearts isn't on the table. She breathed, the words barely a vibration. She's behind your back. Lorenzo didn't flinch. He didn't turn. But the air around him turned to ice. He tapped the rim of his glass twice, a signal to his own men. More bourbon, sir? Ilara asked louder this time, her hand shaking just enough to splash a dark drop of liquid onto the green felt of the poker table. The silence that followed was deafening. The Romano lieutenant stopped laughing. He stared at the stain, then up at Ilara with eyes like a shark. You clumsy brat, he growled, his hand moving toward the holster inside his jacket. Ilara didn't wait. She dropped the bottle, the glass shattering like a gunshot, and dived for the floor. Chapter 1. The heavy crystal decanter shattered against the mahogany floor, a sound like a starting pistol that the world hadn't expected to hear. For a heartbeat, the VIP vault of the Gilded Lily was frozen in the amber glow of the chandeliers, a tableau of men who realized too late that the board had been flipped. Then, the ceiling roared. Plaster and dust exploded from the rafters as the first heavy-caliber rounds tore through the velvet curtains. Ilara didn't have time to scream. She felt a hand like a vice grip her shoulder, a force so sudden and absolute that her feet left the floor. Lorenzo Moretti didn't dive for cover. He moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a man who lived in the center of the storm. He yanked Ilara toward him, using her smaller frame as a momentary screen as he surged up from his chair. Get down, he snarled, but he didn't let her go. He spun her, his body acting as a shield for her even as he used the momentum to kick the heavy poker table over. $1,000 chips scattered like plastic rain, and the treaty bled out onto the floor in a spray of splintered wood and lead. Across the room, Sofia Romano's face had transformed. The mask of the elegant fiancée was gone, replaced by a cold, sharpened fury. She was already moving toward the exit, flanked by her father's men, while the Romano lieutenant, who had been ready to execute Alara, was now clutching a throat that had been opened by a shard of the broken bourbon bottle. "You," Lorenzo hissed, pinning Alara against the cold stone of the back wall while bullets sparked off the marble pillars inches from his head. His eyes weren't on the gunman, they were locked onto hers, burning with a terrifying newfound clarity. "The Queen of Hearts. How did you know?" "The deck." Alara gasped, the metallic scent of gunpowder clogging her throat. "The backs. The patterns don't match the light. And Sophia. She wasn't playing the game, Lorenzo. She was playing you." A second volley of gunfire shredded the velvet seat where Lorenzo had been sitting seconds before. His underboss was down, and the main exit was a wall of fire. Lorenzo looked at the chaos, then back at the waitress whose hands were covered in his spilled bourbon. He realized in that instant that his soldiers had seen nothing, but this ghost had seen everything. "The service tunnels," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "You know where they go." "I do," Alara whispered, her terror hardening into a cold, sharp survival instinct. "Then you're the only way I walk out of here alive," Lorenzo said, drawing a matte black pistol from his holster. "Lead the way, or we both die in the dark." Chapter 2. The tires of the armored sedan screamed against the rain-slicked pavement as Lorenzo pulled the vehicle into a sharp, bone-jarring drift. Behind them, the Gilded Lily was a receding nightmare of sirens and smoke, but the silence inside the car was heavier than the gunfire they had left behind. Lorenzo's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his breathing a jagged rhythm in the dark. He didn't look at Alara, but the predatory intensity radiating from him made the small space feel like a pressure cooker. "Talk," he commanded, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "You didn't just see the cards. You knew the players. Start with the names." Alara huddled in the leather seat, her uniform stained with the expensive bourbon and cheap blood of men who had underestimated her. She closed her eyes, and the waitress's ledger opened in her mind, a mental map of every secret whispered over the rim of a glass for the last 3 years. "Marco," she began, her voice gaining a sharp, clinical edge that surprised even her. "Your underboss. He wasn't just laughing at Sophia's jokes. 3 weeks ago, in the corner booth, he met with Sophia's father. They didn't exchange money, they exchanged a ledger. Marco was promised the Southside docks once you were removed." Lorenzo's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. The betrayal of a lifelong friend was a bitter pill, but he didn't interrupt. "Vincenzo, your head of security," she continued, the names falling from her lips like spent shells. "He's been clearing the snipers' paths for months. Every time you went to the docks, he reported your position to the Romanos. And the floor manager, Gilbert? He was the one who ensured the north door was locked tonight. He's been on the Romanos' payroll since last Christmas." Lorenzo swerved to avoid a roadblock, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. He looked at Alara then, really looked at her, seeing for the first time that the invisible girl was the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal. She wasn't just a survivor. She was an archive of his empire's rot. "They think you're a nobody," Lorenzo whispered, a dark, dangerous smile finally tugging at the corner of his mouth. "They think you're a ghost. But a ghost is exactly what I need to haunt them. Keep talking, Alara. Don't stop until every traitor is counted." Chapter 3. The industrial skeleton of the Southside docks loomed out of the fog like a graveyard of rusted iron. Lorenzo killed the headlights blocks away, gliding the sedan into the shadow of a derelict warehouse. The air here was thick, with salt, diesel, and the iron tang of impending violence. Lorenzo's hand was a heavy weight on the dashboard, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "We're meeting a contact at Pier 14, he whispered, checking the action on his pistol. "If the Romanos haven't reached him first." They hadn't even cleared the first row of shipping containers when the night exploded. A red laser dot danced across Lorenzo's chest, and a heavy caliber round punched through the metal crate beside Alara's head. "Ambush!" Lorenzo roared, dragging her behind a stack of lumber. 2 black SUVs roared from the fog, pinning them against the water's edge. Muzzle flashes flickered like strobes in the mist, pinning them down. Lorenzo returned fire, but he was outnumbered and outpositioned. "They've got the exits blocked," he spat, his breathing labored. "We're trapped against the pier." Alara pressed her back against the rough wood, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She looked at the giant digital clock on the crane overhead. 1:55 a.m. She didn't see a battlefield. She saw a shift change. "No," she gasped, grabbing Lorenzo's arm. "We aren't trapped. Look at the time. What are you talking about?" "The 2 a.m. fuel whistle," Alara said, her eyes wide with a desperate plan. "The night shift at the refinery next door flushes the pressure valves every night at 2. It creates a steam cloud thick enough to blind a man. And the cargo loaders for the morning freight? They arrive through the service gate in 5 minutes, 300 men in identical gray coveralls. Lorenzo looked at the refinery pipes, then back at her. The steam is our cover. The shift change is our exit. Exactly, she said. When that whistle blows, don't run for the car. Run for the locker room. If we can get inside before the valves close, we become invisible. The whistle shrieked, a piercing, industrial scream that tore through the gunfire. Seconds later, a wall of white scalding steam erupted from the refinery, swallowing the SUVs and the gunmen in an opaque fog. Under the shroud of the artificial cloud, Ilara took Lorenzo's hand, not as a victim, but as a guide, and led him into the gray sea of workers. To the Romanos, they were ghosts lost in the mist. To the city, they were just two more bodies in the machinery of the night. Chapter 4. The Safe House was a glass-walled penthouse that felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. Outside, the Chicago skyline was a blurred mosaic of rain and neon, but inside, the air was brittle. Lorenzo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the storm. Sophia sat in a velvet armchair, her emerald silk dress torn at the hem, her face a mask of defiant ivory. She didn't look like a woman caught in a betrayal. She looked like a queen, awaiting her execution. I gave you everything, Sophia. Lorenzo's voice was a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to rattle the glass. My name, my trust, a seat at a table men die to even look at. And you handed me to the snipers for a marked deck of cards. Sophia didn't flinch. In our world, Lorenzo, love is just a luxury we afford ourselves before the lights go out. My father wanted an empire. You were just the obstacle. Ilara stood in the shadows of the kitchen, her presence as unnoticed as it had been at the Gilded Lily. But she wasn't just a witness anymore. She was an investigator. While Lorenzo focused on the woman who had broken his heart, Ilara's eyes were on Sophia's clutch bag, discarded on the side table. Specifically, she was looking at the small, encrypted tablet that had fallen half out of the silk lining. As the argument escalated into a roar of accusations, Ilara moved. She swiped the tablet, her fingers dancing across the screen with the speed of someone who had spent her breaks learning the digital secrets of the wealthy. She didn't find bank accounts or hit lists. She found a folder labeled Leo. Inside were photos of a teenage boy, Sophia's younger brother, chained to a radiator in a basement that looked exactly like the Romano family's private holding cells. Lorenzo, stop! Ilara's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. He turned, his rage momentarily diverted toward the waitress. Stay out of this, Ilara. She didn't do it for the Empire, Ilara said, stepping into the light and holding out the tablet. She did it for him. Your father-in-law isn't just using Sophia to kill you. He's using her brother to kill her soul. He told her if you didn't die tonight, Leo would. The silence that followed was heavy. Lorenzo took the tablet, his eyes scanning the proof of a father's cruelty. He looked at Sophia, whose mask finally shattered, her eyes filling with a desperate, jagged grief. The betrayal was real, but the villain wasn't the woman in the chair. He was the man who had turned his own daughter into a weapon. Chapter 5. The white marble cathedral was a misnomer. It was a sprawling, windowless fortress of concrete and steel, cold enough to freeze the blood in your veins. Lorenzo stood at the perimeter, his silhouette a dark promise of violence against the flickering industrial lights. Sophia was beside him, her face set in a mask of desperation as she stared at the heavy iron doors that held her brother captive. Inside, the Romano hit squad was dug in like ticks, waiting for Lorenzo to walk into the kill zone. They have the thermal sensors active, Lorenzo noted, his voice a low growl. We step through those doors, and we're lit up like targets in a shooting gallery. We need a way to kill the eyes of the building. I can do it, Ilara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline humming through her limbs. She wasn't looking at the front gate. She was looking at the ventilation intake on the roof, a narrow, grimy chute that no soldier in a tactical vest could ever fit through. I spent 3 years at the Lily learning how to move through the walls when the floor managers were looking for us. To them, the vents were just trash chutes. To me, they were the only way to breathe. Lorenzo looked at her, the invisible girl who had become his most lethal asset. He reached out, his thumb brushing the grime on her cheek. Go dark, Ilara. Give me 30 seconds of blindness, and I'll give you the Romanos. She didn't hesitate. Ilara ascended the rusted fire escape, her small frame disappearing into the ductwork. Inside, the world was a cacophony of humming fans and metallic echoes. She moved with the silence of a ghost, navigating the labyrinthine vents until she reached the central junction. Below her, through the slats of a grate, she saw the Romano lieutenants, their rifles trained on the entrance. She reached into her belt and pulled out the high-frequency distress beacon, the tool she had used to summon help from the shadows of the casino. She didn't trigger the alarm. She jammed the transmitter directly into the building's main circuit board. The cathedral died. The lights flickered and plunged into a suffocating, absolute black. The thermal sensors shrieked and failed. In the sudden vacuum of sound and sight, the heavy front doors were kicked off their hinges. Lorenzo Moretti entered the darkness, guided only by the muzzle flashes of his own wrath. From within the walls, Ilara watched the empire of the men who had ignored her begin to crumble, one shadow at a time. Chapter 6. The dust hadn't even settled in the darkened hallways of the cathedral before the digital slaughter began. While the Romano hitmen lay neutralized or fleeing, Lorenzo stood in the center of the command hub, his face illuminated by the cold blue glow of a dozen monitors. He wasn't reaching for his gun this time. He was reaching for the phone. "The Cayman accounts," Lorenzo directed, his voice a calm, terrifying edge of frost. "And the shell companies registered to the Panama port. Ilara, give me the names." Ilara stood beside him, her reflection ghosted in the glass. She didn't need a laptop or a briefcase of files. She simply reached into the archive of her mind, the Waitress's ledger, that had been compiling secrets for 1,000 nights. "The Romano patriarch isn't holding his wealth in gold, Lorenzo," she said, her voice steady and clinical. "Look for Azure Sky Logistics. It's the front he used for the kickbacks from the union bosses. The password isn't a number, it's the date of his first murder. November 12, 1984. Lorenzo's fingers flew across the keys. A second later, a progress bar on the screen began to crawl, draining millions from the Romano vaults into the Moretti accounts. "Got it," he whispered. "There's more," Ilara continued, her eyes narrowing as she recalled a whispered conversation from a rainy Tuesday in May. "The real estate in the West Loop isn't held by the family. It's in the name of Sophia's aunt, Elena. They've been laundering the drug money through a chain of dry cleaners. If you seize the deeds tonight, you leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs." One by one, the Romano assets flickered from green to red on the digital map. It was a systematic decapitation of an empire, performed not with blades, but with the information they had assumed was beneath their notice. Lorenzo watched as the Romano's net worth plummeted towards zero, the sound of his keystrokes, the only eulogy for a dynasty. He turned to Ilara, the silence between them thick with a new kind of respect. "You didn't just save my life tonight, Ilara," he said, the blue light of the screens making him look like a phantom king. "You gave me the city. They thought you were a ghost, but you were the one holding the keys to the kingdom." Chapter 7. 6 months later, the heavy oak doors of the Gilded Lily swung open, but the hush that followed wasn't born of the usual fearful submission to a monster. It was a silence of profound, trembling respect. The scent of expensive tobacco and vintage bourbon still clung to the velvet, but the atmosphere had shifted. The rot of betrayal had been purged, replaced by the ironclad stability of a new order. Ilara Vance walked across the polished marble floor, the rhythmic click of her heels echoing like a heartbeat through the lounge. She wasn't wearing a starch-stiff uniform or scuffed, non-slip flats. She was draped in silk the color of midnight, a diamond necklace, the real one, resting against her collarbone. She didn't look at the floor, and she didn't move like a ghost. She moved like the sun around which the city now orbited. She reached Table 1, the center of the universe. The men who sat there, dons, lieutenants and power brokers who had once seen her as nothing more than a pair of floating hands, stood in unison. Lorenzo Moretti was already there, standing beside the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table. He didn't look at her with the cold, storm-gray eyes of a master, but with the fierce, prideful heat of a partner. He pulled out the chair for her, a gesture that signaled to every person in the room that the era of the invisible girl was over. Ilara sat, resting her hands on the green felt where she had once spilled bourbon to save a king. She looked at the faces around the table, her mental ledger, open and active, reading the tells and secrets that others were too arrogant to see. "The Queen of Hearts is on the table tonight," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried throughout the vault. He placed his hand over hers, his signet ring catching the light. "And she's the only one holding the cards." Ilara looked at the door manager, Gilbert's replacement, who was hovering nervously with a crystal decanter. She offered a small dangerous smile, the smile of a woman who had climbed out of the shadows to own the light. "More bourbon, please," she said, her voice clear and commanding. "And this time, make sure everyone has a glass. We're toasting to the new matriarch."